Manufacturing Consent by Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky was published in 1988. This groundbreaking book outlined the propaganda model which capitalism uses to control our news and information by ensuring that we are exposed only to narratives and perspectives which reinforce the capitalist agenda of wealthy elites. Noam Chomsky today is 91 years old. He is considered one of the early pioneers of modern linguistics, beginning his career in the 1950s, and he's been an activist since at least the 1960s when he became a vocal critic of the capitalist imperialism and warmongering of the United States and other wealthy nations. For decades, Chomsky has produced mountains of evidence that the elites of the United States of America and its allies rely on soft power and intense but subtle use of propaganda to set the global agenda and manipulate the voting public into consenting to the destructive and exploitative practices of the rich and powerful. The term soft power was coined by Joseph Nye in his 1990 book, Bound to Lead: The Changing Nature of American Power. Nye describes soft power this way. When one country gets other countries to want what it wants, it might be called co-optive or soft power, in contrast with the hard or command power of ordering others to do what it wants. Nye was an influential neoliberal political theorist, and if you aren't familiar with neoliberal doctrine, I do have a video that describes the ideology in detail, link in the description, but long story short, neoliberalism is a form of free market capitalism based on privatization, deregulation, globalization, and austerity. It's the ideology which currently dominates most of the world. Anyway, Nye describes soft power as a form of seduction and co-option as opposed to coercion, and claimed that neoliberal powers could attract other nations to fall in line without having to use the threat of violence or force. Of course, in practice, things are more complicated. In a paper written for the Journal of International Studies in 2005, Dr. J.B. Mattern, an international relations researcher, wrote, "In the context of world politics, it makes far more sense to model attraction as a relationship that is constructed through representational force, a non-physical but nevertheless coercive form of power that is exercised through language. Insofar as attraction is sociolinguistically constructed through representational force, soft power should not be understood in juxtaposition to hard power, but as a continuation of it by different means." When the USA uses humanitarian funding as a form of soft power, for instance, it should go without saying that this is indeed an inherent threat of violence, since if the humanitarian funding is withheld, human beings in the target country will suffer or even die. Even something as seemingly innocent as exporting culture, such as music and films, to foreign countries, can be seen as a form of violence, since the foreign culture supplants the local culture of the target country and exposes people to the propaganda model of the exporting country. When Vietnamese teenagers listen to Korean pop music instead of Vietnamese music, or watch American dramas instead of Vietnamese dramas, it may seem like a harmless or even positive form of cultural exchange, but it can't be denied that these exchanges can also serve as vehicles for slipping foreign propaganda and undermining Vietnamese culture and values, and even undermining the Vietnamese economy, since so much money is made off of these pop music and films and television shows and that sort of thing. The point is, these exchanges don't occur in a vacuum, and it can be certain that the hegemonic ruling class of neoliberal institutions will use cultural influences whenever and wherever possible to exert soft power over other nations. Soft power is then essentially a manipulation strategy used to dominate without appearing to dominate. Whenever possible, the preferred application of soft power is to influence and nudge the situation so subtly that the manipulation goes almost undetected. The next best strategy is to force activity without appearing forceful. And when soft power fails, of course, hard power is always kept in reserve as an option. Edward S. Herman, Chomsky's co-author for Manufacturing Consent, put it this way: "Ruling by soft power would seem better than ruling by violence, but this is a selection based on public relations expediency, not any aversion to violence which is used when really needed." Soft power thus is the neoliberal manifestation of what early 20th century Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci termed hegemony. Gramsci described how a ruling class could use its tremendous power over media and culture to make their own ends seem commonsensical or even desirable by the dominated. With all these things in mind, we can view Chomsky's propaganda model for manufacturing consent as a function of soft power. As Chomsky wrote, "In countries where the levers of power are in the hands of a state bureaucracy, the monopolistic control over the media, often supplemented by official censorship, makes it clear that media serves the ends of a dominant elite. It is much more difficult to see a propaganda system at work where the media are private and formal censorship is absent. This is especially true where the media actively compete, periodically attack and expose corporate and governmental malfeasance, and aggressively portray themselves as spokesmen for free speech and the general community interest. What is not evident and remains undisclosed in the media is the limited nature of such critiques, as well as the huge inequality in command of resources and its effect both on access to a private media system and on its behavior and performance. A propaganda model focuses on this inequality of wealth and power and its multi-level effects on mass media interests and choices. It traces the routes by which money and power are able to filter out the news fit to print, marginalize dissent, and allow the government and dominant private interests to get their messages across to the public. Now, if you're interested, there's a link in the description to an excerpt from Manufacturing Consent which explains in detail the 5 filters which compose the capitalist propaganda model. But to put it succinctly, it all comes down to soft power. The purpose of the media under capitalism is to manufacture consent through soft power, to influence the working class into signing off on the agenda of powerful elites without even realizing they've been influenced. So, in summary, we can begin to see the structure where soft power is the neoliberal mode of hegemony, and manufacturing consent is a function of soft power. Powerful neoliberal nations use soft power to dominate smaller, poorer nations internationally. Writing for truthout.org in 2014, Chomsky wrote, "The US, conscious of soft power, undertakes major campaigns of public diplomacy, aka propaganda, to create a favorable image, sometimes accomplished by worthwhile policies that are welcomed, but when the world persists in believing that the United States is by far the greatest threat to peace, the American press scarcely reports the fact. The ability to ignore unwanted facts is one of the prerogatives of unchallenged power. Closely related is the right to radically revise history." As an example of American revision of history to develop soft power, Chomsky cites the Battle of Fallujah in Iraq in 2004, which was widely documented as the setting of some of the most vicious and disgraceful war crimes of the aggression. Though this was later revised to be seen as a battle in which American soldiers in vain fought and died to liberate Fallujah.
These men are shot in the leg. They're both bleeding profusely, dangerous, life-threatening wounds.
Even so, the injured Castle fires back, taking down an insurgent.
Chomsky writes that such revisions of history are necessary to provide protection against reality for the powerful, because if the dominated classes were to fully grasp the true extent of capitalist criminality and destruction, it would become much more difficult to apply soft power in international relations and manufacture consent domestically. Because, of course, soft power is also used domestically to dominate the working class through the manufacturing consent propaganda model and various other strategies. Karl Marx describes society as being composed of a base and a superstructure. The base was composed of the forces and relations of production, basically the ways in which people work together to produce the necessities of life. In the case of capitalism, the base is the capitalist mode of production. The superstructure of society includes everything that is not directly related to production: art, family, culture, law, science, media, education, and so on. According to Marx, the superstructure could influence the base, but the base has predominant influence over the superstructure. Now, in this current neoliberal phase of capitalism, it would seem that capital has become quite proficient at influencing our social superstructure through soft power. And the primary vehicle for applying soft power, domestically and abroad, is the institution. Neoliberal institutions of various types are built in various sectors to extend soft power over every segment of human society. Such institutions include universities, newspapers, corporate media, nonprofits and NGOs, think tanks, and foundations which reinforce capitalist hegemony by producing soft power and manufacturing consent. My partner Luna has created some great videos over on her channel Luna Oi, which documents some of the ways soft power and manufacturing of consent have been used both to dominate and coerce the nation of Vietnam into opening up to neoliberal capitalist hegemony, and also to convince people in the USA and around the world that Vietnam is a scary, authoritarian hellscape by virtue of being socialistic in nature. Links to the full videos are in the description, but here are some short stories. In the 1970s and 1980s, Vietnam suffered tremendously from embargoes pushed by the United States simply because of its socialist economy. Vietnam was still devastated from decades of war going back to the 1940s. And once the USSR collapsed in 1991, Vietnam became virtually isolated economically. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and various other capitalistic institutions applied intensive soft power pressure on Vietnam to force it to open up a free market economy through what became known as the Doi Moi reforms. The truth is, Vietnam had very little choice in these matters. The Vietnamese economy was in a desperate state with very few nations willing to trade due to the draconian American-backed embargoes, and so Vietnam was forced to yield to the soft power pressure. Yet the story was spun in the international press as though Vietnam had completely voluntarily decided on its own terms to open up to capitalist markets. Again, as Joseph Nye said, when one country gets other countries to want what it wants, it might be called co-optive or soft power. And so the Doi Moi market reforms in Vietnam were a decisive soft power win for the USA and its capitalist allies, enacted through the institutional power of an array of NGOs and capitalist institutions. Another example of soft power being used against Vietnam is the narrative of the so-called cyber army that was circulated heavily back in 2017 by international press agencies like Reuters, as well as NGOs like Human Rights Watch. These institutions spun a wild narrative about a 10,000 soldier strong cyber army being used by Vietnam to savagely silence online dissent, when in reality, as Luna documents in one of her videos, this cyber army was little more than a run-of-the-mill cybersecurity initiative that was really not any different from similar measures enacted in the UK, Australia, South Korea, and many other nations around the world without condemnation from these institutions. Here is another example of how capitalist-serving institutions use soft power to create a narrative that demonizes a supposedly authoritarian communist nation while making so-called capitalist democracies look superior by comparison, all by manipulating the facts and building a false narrative to protect capitalist powers like the USA against the reality that they themselves are documented to possess massive online spying operations through the NSA, the CIA, and other agencies. Now you may be wondering, what avenues do we have for opposing the soft power domination of these neoliberal institutions? How do we oppose these institutions? How do you fight an enemy that works very hard to make itself invisible? Well, I would argue that the best way to challenge the power of neoliberal soft power institutions is through the construction of self-organized oppositional power structures. By producing independent media and democratizing communication, we can produce and share our own counter-narratives in opposition to consent manufacturing soft power institutions. Now, a couple of decades ago, this would have been nearly impossible. Certainly independent media existed, but it was much weaker than what exists today. Manufacturing Consent, which I'll remind you was written in 1988, explained the cost of machinery alone of even very small newspapers has for many decades run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. This high cost served as a filter, a barrier to entry. The limitation on ownership of media with any substantial outreach by the requisite large size of investment was applicable a century or more ago, and it has become increasingly effective over time. Today, only 6 companies own almost all the media in the entire world, and independent media is infamous for financially struggling, especially whenever it pushes a countercultural narrative that goes against the grain of neoliberal hegemony. In the 19th century, communists and anarchists and other anti-capitalists struggled to spread their ideas through the printed page. The Communist Manifesto's first print run was limited to 1,000 copies. In the 1920s, communist newspapers such as L'Humanité in Paris and the Daily Worker in the USA struggled to make ends meet and had limited circulation funded by subscriptions and donations only. During the counterculture era of the 1960s and 70s, activists printed zines and opened bookshops, but again, it was comparatively expensive and difficult to circulate compared to the overwhelming scale of capitalist mass media distribution. Of course, one of the major problems is advertising, which Chomsky described as another filter used to generate soft power and manufacture consent. Because media is primarily funded today by advertising, any message that is unfriendly to advertisers will not be able to survive and circulate as strongly as capitalist messaging that is advertising friendly. And only stories and articles and programs which are friendly to advertisers will be published explicitly by corporate media outlets. But in the early 2000s, a new technology emerged, which has given way to a new era of independent, at least semi-democratized media. And you're watching it right now! That's right, baby. Social fucking media. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit. These sites have transformed virtually every human being into a journalist, every device into a printing press. The doors have been blown wide open, except not really, of course. After all, social media is overwhelmingly dominated by corporations, and having a lot of money gives you a massive edge in terms of reach, with capitalist-friendly entities and traditional media institutions dropping millions upon millions of dollars in ad buys. YouTube famously pumps alt-right content down the throats of young people through the algorithm. Facebook unabashedly spreads fake news. Twitter is festering with bots and sock puppet accounts that manipulate, distort, and harass on a massive scale. And Reddit, Well, Reddit's just a shithole. And all of these corporations have complete control over their algorithms. They can pull secret levers whenever they want to filter stories so that some things get seen a lot and others not so much. And they've admitted explicitly to doing so. They've run experiments and implemented programs designed to manipulate our emotions and manipulate our experience of the world. So yeah, not exactly the democratic revolution in media we were hoping for. And yet, is it possible that these platforms have given us just enough of a voice to begin to challenge the hegemony of neoliberal soft power institutions? After all, there are a lot of clever people using social media. Some of us have figured out how to manipulate or override the algorithms to break through that barrier just a little bit more than these platforms would probably prefer. And thanks to other platforms like Patreon, GoFundMe, and Venmo, independent voices aren't as reliant on the advertising model as in the past. And upstart media platforms like TikTok are allowing information and ideas to spread in ways that the neoliberal hegemony just could not have predicted. As such, a small but tenacious core of content creators and social media personalities have been able to hack together a presence online that have grown into independent institutions in their own right. Not all of this is good, of course. Obviously, there's a massive amount of fascist and alt-right content being generated by these institutions, but increasingly we have power blocks forming for marginalized and radical revolutionary groups as well. LeftTube, Communist TikTok, Black Twitter, Trans Discord, the list goes on and on. We are starting to see the emergence of real collective power for groups who, until now, have never been able to have this kind of media presence at any point in history. For lack of a better term, let's call these ground-up independent, non-institutional entities independent voices. At first, I think the neoliberal hegemonic powers that be thought they had things pretty under control. Facebook and Twitter early on devised the verified account, the little blue check marks that were supposed to give an edge to individuals and entities backed by institutional authority. YouTube had its featured page, which it used to shovel content at us that was generated by hegemonic institutions and hegemony-approved creators. And of course, videos and stories that featured controversial subject matter like communism, anarchism, anti-racism, LGBTQ+ issues, and so on would be buried algorithmically and demonetized. Another important way in which institutions have tried to project power onto social media is through the aforementioned falsely independent voices like PragerU, Turning Point USA, and so many others. But despite these self-protective measures, countercultural independent voices have been able to emerge, network together, and to some extent at least, flourish. And those little blue check marks have become, in many circles, a point of ridicule, and that featured page on YouTube has become a laughing stock, and all the institutional checks and balances against independent voices have been identified and analyzed, and to greater or lesser extent, nullified by independent voices who didn't turn out to be as naive and easy to goad as the institutional social media powers that be believed us to be. And this has led to some of the most important cultural movements in the last few years. The Me Too movement started as a hashtag on Twitter and grew like wildfire to expose a massive number of powerful men who were guilty of sexual harassment and change the ways in which we think about women in the workplace. The Black Lives Matter movement has exploded thanks to live streams of police brutality and murder caught on camera, and Black activists have been able to communicate in unprecedented ways to discuss and strategize their resistance. Live streams have been instrumental to the Black Lives Matter protests this year, with hundreds of hours being logged every day by activists who are sharing their stories and spreading the word about these protests and the police brutality that occurs at these protests, even as mainstream news institutions have stopped covering the continuing actions and downplayed this systemic state abuse of protesters. Discord, Wire, and Signal groups have sprung up for radical activists to coordinate and organize. Panel discussions are occurring on Zoom and Twitch and Facebook Live. People are connecting, rallying, and developing bases of power in meaningful ways. And I think the institutions are starting to notice. I think they're starting to worry. And I think they're worrying because for the first time, these institutions have found themselves on the other end of the power equation. Just a decade ago, if a police officer killed a black man in the streets, even if it were videotaped, black people would not have been able to mount a massive international uprising to fight back against police brutality. Of course, there were black people online 10 years ago, but they didn't have the power structures established, the networks established to fight back with their own stories, their own opinions, their own truth. Just a decade ago, if a powerhouse celebrity like J.K. Rowling wanted to share transphobic views on daytime talk shows or evening news, she would have been able to do so relatively free of any repercussions. Sure, there were trans people on social media back in 2010, but they were not connected together then the way they are now. They didn't have the organization and the voice to deliver a proper response to Rowling's narrative. It took a few years, but it seems that the oppressed have started to figure out how to self-organize on social media. And yeah, I think the institutions and their gatekeepers are getting concerned. They're beginning to realize that they've underestimated the very people they dominate. They're beginning to see the existential threat that empowered, self-organized democratic communication poses to their hegemonic soft power. Enter the Harper's letter, published on July 7th, just a few days before this video is coming out. The Harper's letter was signed by 153 figures who represent institutional authority, ranging from J.K. Rowling to Salman Rushdie to Noam Chomsky? Wow, Chomskys himself signed this letter, so I guess it must be a challenge to institutional authority, right? I mean, it has to challenge the hegemonic soft power structures that manufacture consent for capitalism. So let's give it a read. Our cultural institutions are facing a moment of trial. Cultural institutions, Powerful protests for racial and social justice are leading to overdue demands for police reform, along with wider calls for greater equality and inclusion across our society, not least in higher education, journalism, philanthropy, and the arts. Seems to be talking about the superstructure of society, all of that neoliberal soft power hegemony, those institutions that drive it. Okay, let's see where they're going with this. But this needed reckoning has also intensified a new set of moral attitudes and political commitments that tend to weaken our norms of open debate and toleration of differences in favor of ideological conformity. As we applaud the first development, we also raise our voices against the second. But Chomskys, you wrote a whole book about how there's not really any open debate and how all of our information is filtered through the manufacturing consent propaganda model. All right, let's keep reading. Let's see where they go with this. The forces of illiberalism are gaining strength throughout the world and have a powerful ally in Donald Trump, who represents a real threat to democracy. But resistance must not be allowed to harden into its own brand of dogma or coercion, which right-wing demagogues are already exploiting. The democratic inclusion we want can be achieved only if we speak out against the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides. Okay, what the fuck? First of all, what does Donald Trump have to do with any of this? And we're only 94 words in before this letter goes completely off the rails. The fact that Noam Chomsky signed this letter is almost impossible for me to believe. For one thing, the forces of illiberalism, really? I mean, right away, this letter is proclaiming itself as rooted in liberal ideology, the same liberal ideology which Noam Chomsky has railed against for decades.
Now liberalism is essentially the theory of state capitalism, of state intervention in a capitalist economy. Well, that has very little relation to classical liberalism. In fact, classical liberalism is what's now called conservatism, I suppose. But this new view, I think, really is, in my view at least, a highly authoritarian position. That is, it's one which accepts a number of centers of authority and control, the state on the one hand, agglomerations of private power on the other hand, all interacting with individuals as malleable cogs in this highly constrained machine, which may be called democratic, but given the actual distribution of power is very far from being meaningfully democratic and cannot be so.
But I digress, so let's move on with the Harper's letter and see what is meant exactly by an intolerant climate that is set in by all sides. The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. While we have come to expect this on the radical right, censoriousness is also spreading more widely in our culture. An intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty. We uphold the values of robust and even caustic counterspeech from all quarters, but it is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought. So yeah, cancel culture. This letter is about cancel culture. Now, there's a lot to be said about cancel culture, and plenty of other writers and YouTubers have covered this in detail better than I could, but let me clarify a few of my own personal positions before we continue. First, cancel culture is a very nebulous term. It means many different things to many different people. Sometimes cancel culture means cyberbullying and online harassment, and I agree that cyberbullying and harassment are terrible. I've been mass harassed on the internet before. I know how destructive that can be. I know that it can lead to suicide, it can destroy innocent lives. So yeah, I personally very much oppose online bullying and harassment, but I don't think cancel culture means online harassment, especially not in this context. Cancel culture has also been used to describe market decisions. So like when Quaker Oats decided to pull the Aunt Jemima syrup brand, that wasn't cancel culture, it was a marketing decision because Quaker Oats simply decided that in our current climate, they would sell more syrup if they rebranded it. No more, no less. That's all it was a market decision. They wouldn't have made that decision if they thought they could make more money with Aunt Jemima's brand intact. So nothing to see here. Now, cancel culture has also been defined as people in positions of institutional authority, such as journalists, celebrities, and other figures being criticized, condemned, or deplatformed. And I believe that this is the definition of cancel culture that the Harper's letter is trying to address. And in this sense, cancel culture has been around forever. The thing is, in the past, it's pretty much only ever been used by powerful hegemonic institutions to cancel people who oppose the hegemony. A few examples. In the 1950s, Joseph McCarthy led a witch hunt in the United States of American Congress, seeking out alleged communists and communist sympathizers, subjecting them to aggressive investigations, and leading to various forms of retribution, such as people getting fired from their jobs, getting blacklisted from working in their industry, and getting barred from appearing in any form of mass media. Now that was certainly a form of cancel culture. In 1967, Muhammad Ali, a black prize fighter, refused to be drafted in the United States Armed Forces to go and fight in Vietnam. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined $10,000, and banned from boxing for 3 years. The US Supreme Court eventually overturned his case, but major newspapers and other mass media of the time labeled him a draft dodger and a loser, and his reputation never really recovered with large segments of the American population. Definitely sounds like cancel culture to me. In 1997, when I was in middle school, actress and comedian Ellen DeGeneres, yes, that Ellen, George W. Bush's best friend, the dancer. Anyway, Ellen had this sitcom called Ellen, in which Ellen played a character named Ellen. Now, word got out that Ellen would be coming out as a lesbian in an episode of Ellen, and all hell broke loose.
Susan, I'm gay.
The puppy episode ended up being an enormous rating success and won multiple awards, but that's not what I remember about it from the time. What I remember was a media firestorm, which resulted from the simple fact that a character on a sitcom was a lesbian.
Since I've witnessed the discrimination and the double standards and heard about the statistics for gay teen suicides, I've had to rethink that. And so if by standing up for what I think is right makes me an activist, I'm an activist.
It's no different than adultery. It's no different than, robbing, stealing, lying, cheating.
We all have things that are wrong with us, and we all do things that are wrong.
That's you saying that it's wrong. Look at all the millions of gay people in this country who don't think that being gay is wrong.
So we should accept it, though?
The studio received at least one bomb threat. DeGeneres was followed by card to the studio by a threatening, suspicious man. News programs across the country fiercely debated whether or not Ellen was a sign of the erosion of family values in the USA. Local TV stations, including the one in South Carolina where I grew up, refused to air the episode, saying that having a lesbian character on a sitcom was immoral. And many believe that the show was canceled the next season because it never quite recovered from this homophobic backlash.
It's funny because all along that was my biggest fear, is that it was going to get canceled. And I was not told that it was canceled. I was told through an assistant who read it in the trades.
Now that is literally fucking cancel culture. And these are just a few small examples. The point is, before the advent of social media, cancel culture was pretty much universally a phenomenon of powerful institutions attacking and destroying marginalized people and people who opposed capitalist hegemony. So, Harper's has been around since 1850. Why didn't they publish this letter in the 1950s, or the 1960s, or the 1990s? Why is this letter just coming out now? Why is cancel culture of such concern to these 153 institutional authority figures all of a sudden when it's been around for so long? Well, it's because for the first time in history, cancel culture is being reflected back at institutions, which the letter states explicitly in the next few lines. More troubling still, institutional leaders in a spirit of panic damage control are delivering hasty and disproportionate punishments instead of considered reforms. Editors are fired for running controversial pieces. Books are withdrawn for alleged inauthenticity. Journalists are barred from writing on certain topics. Professors are investigated for quoting works of literature in class. A researcher is fired for circulating a peer-reviewed academic study, and the heads of organizations are ousted for what are sometimes just clumsy mistakes. Whatever the arguments around each particular incident, the result has been to steadily narrow the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. We are already paying the price in greater risk aversion among writers, artists, and journalists who fear for their livelihoods if they depart from the consensus or even lack sufficient zeal in agreement. So there you have it. The signers of this letter aren't upset because of cancel culture per se. They are upset because cancel culture is starting to affect their own institutional positions of hegemonic soft power. Now, I'm not really here today to litigate each and every claim that's being made by this letter. I could only find one instance, for instance, of an editor losing his job from what can be described as cancel culture, and that was James Bennett, who resigned from his job as editor at the New York Times for publishing an article by Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton calling for the military to be sent in to attack protesters, which Bennett admitted he didn't even read before publishing, and which caused a full-scale staff revolt. And you know what? Fuck James Bennett. He deserved to lose his job for that, and I don't really think it was the result of cancel culture as much as it was the result of James Bennett making a really terrible, terrible decision. But anyway, that's just my opinion. I'm not here to say whether or not all these claims are true or false. You can decide what you agree with or what you don't agree with. The claims are so vague, it's hard to even know what the hell the Harper's letter is even talking about. But to me, it's not important if people at these powerful institutions are actually losing their jobs unfairly because of cancel culture or not. I'm much more interested in the power dynamics at play with the wider situation. So let me finish reading the letter now, and then I'll tell you what I mean. This stifling atmosphere will ultimately harm the most vital causes of our time. The restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation. The way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. We refuse any false choice between justice and freedom, which cannot exist without each other. As writers, we need a culture that leaves us room for experimentation, risk-taking, and even mistakes. We need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. If we don't defend the very thing on which our work depends, we shouldn't expect the public or the state to defend it for us. Again, can you believe that Noam friggin' Chomsky signed this letter? The whole point of manufacturing consent is that under capitalism, debate is already restricted by these powerful institutions. That it doesn't take an overtly repressive government to eliminate democratic participation. That the only ideas allowed to filter through to us through the cultural hegemony of manufactured consent is that which is approved by the powerful elites of the state and capital. And yet, Noam Chomsky signed this letter. I think the whole letter is summed up with this line: we need to preserve the possibility of good faith disagreement without dire professional consequences. This really does come down to the preservation of professional power within these hegemonic institutions against the threat of independent, self-organized, democratic media, independent voices. These intellectuals, these authorities, these verified blue-check gatekeepers are feeling their institutional authority threatened for the first time, and they are rallying a panicked defense. That's what the Harper's letter is. It's an act of desperate retaliation to defend the credibility of credentialists who believe that they are entitled to positions of cultural and intellectual authority due to their positions within the hierarchical structures of hegemonic institutions. I expect to see this letter being adopted and referenced as a manifesto by blue check hegemony for a long time. Because remember, this isn't just about cancel culture. These institutional authorities have had the ability and power to cancel people for a very long time. Now let me reiterate, this is a complicated situation and I don't wish to oversimplify it. To begin with, there are more than two sides at play here. We have the traditional hegemonic institutions on one side, yes. On the other, we have a fractured landscape of every manner of independent power blocks and media producers, ranging from communists, independent liberals, to independent conservatives, to alt-right and fascist elements. So this isn't simply a David and Goliath story where one side is good and the other side is evil. For one thing, many so-called independent media sources aren't so independent after all. For instance, PragerU and Turning Point USA present themselves as alternative independent media when, in fact, they are funded by deep-pocketed right-wing entities such as the Koch brother. So there's a lot going on, a lot of interplay between various interests, and of course the institutions themselves are not all monolithic. There's plenty of conflict between Fox News and CNN, between the Cato Institute and the Progressive Policy Institute, but this institutional conflict will only go so deep because none of these institutions will seriously call into question the bedrock underpinnings of capitalism, of the state, of the powerful entities that fund and indirectly govern them. But there is one, I think, binary source of tension, one direct contradiction that I think I have identified, and it all has to do with the legitimacy of institutional power. What's really being called into question here is the license of institutions to establish and control hierarchies of communication and information. I think the main question that's being asked by our society right now has very little to do with whether or not certain individuals should be canceled. I think the real question is, why do powerful institutions have so much authority to cancel and promote, to filter information, to hire and fire journalists and intellectuals, to tamper with the algorithms that decide what we see, to ban or deplatform users? The real tension is one between democratic and authoritarian control of information. Within our own independent power structures, activists have gotten a taste for democracy. We've been able to build decentralized affiliation networks which allow us to self-select who we trust and who we do not. We've created more intimate bonds with our information sources. For example, when the Chaz Chop situation was at its height in Seattle, I was very curious and I had a hard time getting answers to my questions through traditional mass media. So what did I do? Well, I got in touch with an activist on the ground named Comrade Carl, and he led me and my audience on a 2-hour live stream tour of Capitol Hill. He answered our questions in real time. There was no filter, no barrier, no institution deciding what we would or wouldn't see or who we would and wouldn't talk to. It was a direct exchange of information that circumvented institutional consent manufacturing processes, and hundreds of people were watching it live. This has never really been possible before in all of human history, and this severely threatens the hegemonic authority of soft power institutions. In 1964, Marshall McLuhan introduced the phrase, "the medium is the message." By this, McLuhan meant that it is a medium of communication itself, and not the messages being carried by said medium, which primarily affect society. In other words, it was the printing press itself which truly changed society much more than the words that were being printed out. The advent of the 24-hour television news cycle affected society much more than anything the individual journalists actually said on the air. Perhaps nothing proves McLuhan's dictum more than the advent of social media, because social media has sculpted our society in ways we are still only just beginning to understand. And I believe social media has the power to unseat institutions precisely because social media delegitimizes institutional authority. Because of social media, we know instantly when corporate news outlets lie to us thanks to crowdsourced real-time fact checks. We can compare broadcast television's coverage of protests side by side with unfiltered amateur live streams in almost real time. We can hear directly from a wide variety of marginalized people instead of hearing the same perspective of the same hand-picked circle of approved marginalized voices that appear on the cable news and editorial circuits. The social medium is, in many ways, the message that the institutional emperor wears no clothes. Let's go back to the examples of Vietnam, with Human Rights Watch using institutional authority to distort the facts about Vietnam's quote-unquote cyber army, and the World Bank and IMF using institutional soft power to pressure Vietnam into market reforms, and news sources like the Associated Press and Reuters manipulating information about Vietnam as it's presented to audiences in the USA and the UK. In her videos on these subjects, Luna pieced together information from a variety of English and Vietnamese language information sources, then built her case and released the information to the English-speaking world via her YouTube channel. These videos have now reached tens of thousands of views, primarily from the English-speaking world. And from what I can tell, this makes Luna one of the very first Vietnamese people in the world to use social media to broadcast her independent voice directly into the imperial core with relatively broad reach. To get to this point, a lot of things had to happen. Vietnam had to have the educational infrastructure for Luna to learn English. Vietnam had to have the internet infrastructure for Luna to have an internet connection. YouTube had to be created. Social media had to be created. And when all of these pieces came together, something magical happened and Luna's channel was born, and now we have this independent voice coming directly from Vietnam to tens of thousands of people all around the world, but in particular in the USA, in the UK, and these places where for decades the only information reaching us has come from the manufacturing consent propaganda models, filtration of information. We're now able to get it directly from Luna, and I think that's amazing. Certainly, she doesn't reach nearly enough people to truly compete with the massive reach of Human Rights Watch, or the global institutional power of the IMF and the World Bank, or the global power and spread of Reuters and the AP, but this is still an unprecedented step forward for the people of Vietnam to raise their own voices against imperialist aggression. Now, looking back to the 1920s, Ho Chi Minh did write extensively to address French workers in Paris, but his articles were only published in communist newspapers such as La Humanité, and in the 1920s, these newspapers were, again, like I said earlier, struggling to stay afloat, relying on donations and scant subscription dues, and the circulation of any given newspaper couldn't have been more than the low thousands. And even then, circulation was limited to the city of Paris and perhaps a few other large French towns. Luna's videos are now today reaching all around the world. She has more reach than Ho Chi Minh did back in the 1920s. She has subtitles being translated into various languages by her audience. She has a sizable audience in Brazil. She's gaining viewership in the Philippines. And of course, she has thousands of subscribers in the USA. Can you imagine what Ho Chi Minh would have been able to do with such a medium? Can you imagine how the working class would have benefited in the 19th and 20th centuries if they had the ability to challenge the authority of institutional media? Now, of course, it's far from a perfect situation. Many have spoken of the effects of clout and embedded systemic bigotry in the way social media platforms are built. After all, most of the largest YouTubers are white cis-het males, even in the leftist content niche. And of course, like we discussed previously, capitalist institutions still have far more clout and reach onto social media platforms than independent voices do. But for the first time, there is potential to overturn some or all of these power dynamics. There is at least the possibility that independent voices could gain more relevance than hegemonic institutions. In 2014, Noam Chomsky wrote the following: "How could we overcome media propaganda and improve the media? This is an old debate. In the US, it has been debated for over a century within the framework of the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which bars government action from preventing publication. Notice that it doesn't protect freedom of speech nor block punishment for speech. There was a view sometimes called corporate libertarianism, which held that the First Amendment should concern negative freedom. That is, the government can't interfere with the right of media owners to do what they want. The other view was social democratic and came out of the New Deal after the Depression and the early post-World War II period. That view held that there should also be positive freedom. In other words, that people should have the right to information as the basis for a democratic society. That battle was waged in the 1940s, and corporate libertarianism won. How do you overcome it? One way is education, but another way is by returning to the concept of positive freedom, which means recognizing that in a democratic society, we put a high value on the right of citizens to have access to a wide range of opinions and beliefs. I would argue that decentralized direct information exchange led by independent voices is a direct challenge to capitalistic institutional information hegemony. And this is the real source of the tension which led to the Harper's letter. The Harper's letter was not addressing individual harassment or cyberbullying. No, the Harper's letter very specifically referred to the ways in which non-institutional independent voices, the unfiltered masses, you and me, have been able to reach in and have an effect within those hierarchies of institutional authority. And so again, I would submit that the real tension comes from we the people, the independent voices of social media, you and me, questioning the legitimacy of institutions of soft power. Why do Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, these massive for-profit institutions, get to unilaterally decide who gets to be platformed and who doesn't? It's this structure which ultimately leads to so-called cancel culture. We, the people, are given a taste of democratic communication on social media, but we remain painfully aware of all the ways in which we are severely restricted. We don't have true ownership of our own voices, nor control of the platforms we use to communicate, nor access to the algorithmic processes that decide what we are and aren't exposed to. This is what leads to masses of people on the internet rising up when injustice is perceived. This is why thousands of people have fought to have Nazis and racists removed from platforms through these public forms of protest on social media. I think J.K. Rowling believed that by virtue of her position within the institutional hierarchy, she would be immune from any pushback from the trans community for her transphobic positions. But trans people were networked and engaged enough on social media to mount concerted, sustained pushback against the narrative she wove in unprecedented ways. I think the mass media thinks that they completely control the narrative of the Black Lives Matter movement, and to some extent they do maintain a pretty firm grasp on that narrative. If you search protest footage on YouTube, you'll see that all the results are coming from corporate news sources in those search results, but they do not have complete control. Independent reporters and activists such as Unicorn Riot are often getting hundreds of thousands of views, and clips on Twitter and Facebook have gone viral despite the best efforts of these institutions. I think James Bennett believed that because he was granted the institutional power of editor by the New York Times, he could get away with publishing an inflammatory, fascistic letter he hadn't even read, and that he would get away with it. But it was his own staff joining together in solidarity that got him fired. Which begs the question, why did Bennett have the job of editor to begin with? Where did his editorial authority come from? It came from the capitalistic hierarchy of the New York Times, which is a for-profit corporation owned by a single family, the Sulzbergers. In fact, A.G. Sulzberger, the current publisher of the New York Times, defended Cotton's piece. Why should one family have so much power over so many people, both in terms of the incredible reach and power the newspaper has on the United States and the world, but also in terms of the lives and livelihood of the 4,320 employees of the New York Times? Perhaps James Bennett was canceled by his own editorial staff and the public at large. Maybe this was unjust. But who even knows how many journalists and editors have been canceled by the Sulzberger family since the paper was founded by them in 1851? And who knows what reasons they had for canceling them? It is the capitalist's privilege to hire and fire, and isn't this the ultimate form of cancel culture? Isn't the capitalist's privilege to fund or defund another potent form of cancel culture? If Human Rights Watch suddenly started saying positive things about socialist nations like Vietnam and spent more time documenting the abuses of capitalist nations like the UK and the USA, would they have received millions of dollars in funding from the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, the Ford Foundation, or from capitalist George Soros? I believe that the appetite for democratic workplaces, democratic media, and democratic institutions is growing. I believe that the power of independent voices has grown to the point where we can begin to directly confront and challenge the authority of entrenched institutions and their very right to hire and fire and ban and platform and manipulate algorithms without our consent or input. Hey, it's EJ with a different haircut here to talk about a few issues related to institutions that didn't make it into the original script. I do want to recognize that there are certain roles that some institutions play in our lives that are undeniably good, and we need to be taking that into consideration as we have discussions like these. So, for instance, the CDC and other healthcare institutions that have an undeniably beneficial role in our lives for educating and protecting and saving lives. We do need to have some structures that allow healthcare professionals and other experts to sort of play those roles that are so important. There was a Twitter thread recently in which a person was talking about their mother, who is a nurse, a trained nurse, buying into right-wing conspiracy junk science that wearing a mask actually doesn't allow your blood to get enough oxygen, which is just, totally spurious pseudoscience that a trained nurse would know is junk science. But this person's mother was trusting these right-wing conspiracy theory spinning people more than their own training as a nurse. And that's scary to me. It's also really scary to me that the data collection role of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the USA, is being handed over by the Trump administration to a private corporate contractor called teletracking. This is terrifying to me. And this is a situation where we have a pretty well-established, pretty trustworthy government institution being privatized in a way that actually just really, really scares the hell out of me. And this is obviously not a good thing. So When I say that we need to be questioning and challenging these institutions, that doesn't mean that every single institution is inherently bad in every way, and I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that to give a little context to this discussion. Okay, back to long hair, freaky EJ. In 1905, Vladimir Lenin pointed out that he believed an equilibrium of forces had been developed in Russia between Tsarist and revolutionary forces. As Lenin put it, Tsarism is no longer strong enough, the revolution not yet strong enough to win, hence the tremendous amount of vacillation. The terrific and enormous increase of revolutionary happenings, strikes, meetings, barricades, committees of public safety, complete paralysis of the government, etc. On the other hand, the absence of resolute repressive measures. The troops are wavering. The court is wavering and biding its time. Strictly speaking, these are its correct tactics. The equilibrium of forces compels it to bide its time, for power is in its hands. The revolution has reached a stage at which it is disadvantageous for the counter-revolution to attack, to assume the offensive. Now, Lenin went on to predict that the Tsar would issue a constitution, and that this constitution would fool the working class into complacency for years to come, which is exactly what happened in many European nations after the proletarian revolutions of 1848. And Lenin was absolutely right. In 1906, the Tsar issued a constitution, and the workers' revolution was held off for another decade. Is it possible that we have entered a state of equilibrium between hegemonic institutional soft power and revolutionary independent voices for control of the superstructure of our society? Is it even possible for the working class to take over the superstructure of society before taking over the base? Has this ever occurred in history? I believe we're in a situation where independent voices have too much power accumulated for the institutions to institute what Lenin called absolute repressive measures. Imagine if right now Twitter suddenly just banned all the trans and black and leftist voices from their platforms that are being accused of projecting powers of cancellation into these institutions. I don't think that would end well for Twitter in the current situation. But independent voices also clearly don't have the accumulated power to overwhelm and topple institutional authority either. It'll take a very long time for that to happen. And so I believe that, yes, we are entering into a state of equilibrium, a protracted and fairly balanced period of indecisive struggle between hegemonic institutions and independent voices over society's superstructure. Haircut EJ here again with one more little quick update. I just wanted to share this gem with you. It turns out that Glenn Greenwald, the journalist that broke the Edward Snowden story, controversial figure, lots of different opinions. I don't agree with a lot of what Glenn Greenwald has to say. But funny enough, the writer of the Harper's letter, Thomas Chatterton Williams, recently went on the record saying that Greenwald was basically canceled from being invited to be a signatory of the Harper's letter because of some of the opinions and statements that Glenn Greenwald has shared in recent times.
Did you consider asking him on? Glenn Greenwald?
Yeah, we did. I would have had him on. Interestingly enough, he's become someone in the past few months that I've interacted with quite a bit on Twitter, and it's been cool. We really,
yeah.
But like, I was outvoted on that.
Interesting. You see, this is interesting because I assume some of the reasons that you were outvoted on that was because of some of his things that were considered beyond the pale. And I'm not like, it's just not a gotcha.
No, I don't actually even remember. There were certain names that some people, there were just certain names that anybody wanted, and then it was like that, like the rest of the people didn't just know, and I don't even remember who it was.
So it seems pretty clear, based on these comments by Thomas Chatterton Williams, that the institutional figures who signed the Harper's letter were more than willing to cancel somebody like Glenn Greenwald and refuse to basically invite Greenwald to sign the letter because they do want to maintain and reserve that institutional authority to gatekeep. So to me, that just further reinforces this idea that the signatories of this letter and the people who are behind the Harper's letter, they're totally okay with institutions gatekeeping and canceling people. They just don't want that cancellation power to flow back in the other direction from the commoners up to the institutional level. Back to the regularly scripted portion. The Harper's letter may have been the first concerted pushback against these independent voices, and I believe this struggle will continue for a long time as institutional gatekeepers continue to try to legitimize their hegemonic power and their ability to manufacture consent to be governed, just as independent voices continue to try to reach into these institutional hierarchies to strike back in every way we can. I think it's bound to be messy. There will be a lot of conflict. There will be a body count, so to speak, and cancel culture will be the nebulous framing of this struggle from the side of the institutions. This will be the rhetorical weapon which the established powers will use to defend their domain of soft power. And this brings me back to Noam Chomsky. Why the hell did he sign the Harper's letter? I cannot understand what value he saw in this statement. It would seem to me that the letter goes against everything Chomsky has written about for decades. I mean, is it just a matter of Chomsky being a 92-year-old mega boomer and not understanding internet culture? Or is it possible that he signed it without reading it too closely? Has he changed his mind about institutional power? Or is he subconsciously simply siding with institutional power because he himself benefits from institutional power? I know that Chomsky considers himself a free speech absolutist and has spoken out against anti-fascist activism, so maybe he really does just see the examples cited by the letter of cancel culture as an online analog to anti-fascists trying to disrupt Nazi power in the streets. I guess it's not really worth speculating over. Maybe eventually Chomsky will elaborate on why he signed the letter, maybe not, but one thing I do believe pretty strongly is that it's entirely possible for Chomsky to be wrong sometimes, to be wrong about this even, but also be right about many other things. And Chomsky being wrong about this or anything else doesn't invalidate the good ideas he's generated over many, many decades. It's important not to essentialize people based on a small sampling of their activities over a long career. In other words, let me just say for the record, I don't think we should cancel Noam Chomsky, whatever that means. Of course, I could be wrong, and if I am, I know you'll be very polite when you tell me about it in the comments. So let me ask, do you think that it's possible for superstructure to change independent of the base? How important are these ideas of cultural hegemony and institutional power in the grand scheme of class struggle? Is all of this a distraction? Or is fighting the soft power of hegemonic institutions just as important, or maybe even more important, than fighting the hard power of capitalist oppression? Let me know, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and share it on social media so that I might algorithmically expand the soft power of my independent voice. Thanks for watching.
Then this is the advertising department, where they handle the advertising that helps so much to pay for the paper. They've just got the last of the ads laid out for the printers. But Charlie's story is done, and he turns his copy in. Charlie's knocked out a good front-page story here. It goes to the copy editor, whose job is to check its form and style. And while he's working it over, let's get acquainted with the wire editor. He handles all the news pouring in from outside the city. This news comes in on the wires to the teletype machine. News services are flashing stories to these machines from all over the world. Here's a story coming in about a hurricane still raging down on the Gulf of Mexico. The wire editor has all this news at his fingertips, and he decides what's to run in the paper. But how's Charlie's story coming along? Well, the copy editor is writing the headlines for it now. Headlines and story